extended her hand across that conference table like she had every right to be there, because she did. And the man at the head of the table looked at her hand, looked at her face, and said, "I don't do introductions with vendors." Except she wasn't the vendor. She was the money. Her name was Diane Okafor. She grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a house where the heat worked 8 months out of 12, and the other 4 months you wore your coat inside, and you didn't complain about it because complaining didn't pay the gas bill. Her mother, Gloria Okafor, cleaned offices downtown 5 nights a week. Her father, James Okafor, drove a delivery truck until his back gave out in 1987, and after that he drove anyway because what else was he going to do? Diane watched all of it. She watched her mother leave the house at 10 p.m. with tired feet and come home at 6 a.m. with more tired feet. And she watched her father wince every time he stood up from a chair. And she decided somewhere around age 11 that she was going to make something out of this life, or she was going to die trying. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, steady, absolutely immovable way. She was a good student. Not a scholarship and fanfare student, just a good, serious student who did the work and remembered what she read and asked the right questions. She went to Ohio State on a partial grant and 2 part-time jobs. She graduated with a finance degree and $14,000 in debt, which in 1994 felt like a mountain, and in retrospect was practically nothing, though she didn't have the retrospect yet. She got a job at a small asset management firm in Columbus. She was the only black woman in the office. She was also the first one in every morning and the last one out, not to impress anyone, but because she genuinely found the work interesting. The patterns in numbers, the logic of risk, the way a portfolio could tell you a story if you knew how to read it. She spent 11 years in Columbus, then moved to Atlanta, then to New York. She built. Slowly, carefully, the way her father used to fix things around the house. Not fast, not showy, but solid. By 2018, Diane Okafor ran a private investment firm with $340 million in assets under management, a staff of 9, and an office on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan that had a view of nothing remarkable but belonged entirely to her. She didn't wear that success loudly. She drove a 6-year-old Volvo. She wore good clothes that weren't flashy. She had a plain leather briefcase she'd carried for 12 years because it worked, and she saw no reason to replace something that worked. People who didn't know her assumed she was someone's assistant. She had stopped correcting people a long time ago. The meeting was set for a Tuesday in March. The company was called Calloway Infrastructure Partners, and it was run by a man named Preston Calloway. Preston Calloway was 63 years old. 4th-generation money. A man who had never had to wonder whether the heat would work because his family had always owned the buildings where the heat came from. He ran Calloway Infrastructure the way his father had run it. And his grandfather before that, with a loud voice, a firm handshake for the right people, and the comfortable assumption that the right people looked a certain way. The meeting had been arranged through a mutual contact, a real estate attorney named David Kessler who had worked with Diane's firm on 3 previous deals. Kessler had spoken with Calloway's chief of staff, a man named Todd Marsh, and explained the situation clearly. Okafor Capital was looking at a possible equity stake in Calloway's upcoming commercial development project in Charlotte. The numbers were significant. The meeting was serious. Kessler had used the word serious 3 times because he knew Calloway needed to hear things more than once. Diane arrived 8 minutes early to the Calloway Infrastructure offices, which occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Park Avenue. She gave her name to the receptionist, a young woman who smiled and asked her to take a seat. Diane sat. She looked at the lobby, the dark wood paneling, the oil paintings of men in suits, the American flag in the corner. She had been in 100 lobbies like this. She knew exactly what they were saying, and she had decided a long time ago not to let them say it to her. David Kessler arrived at 9:58. They rode the elevator up together. The conference room was large, with a long table that could seat 16, and windows that looked south over Midtown. Already seated when Diane and Kessler entered were 4 men. Preston Calloway at the head of the table, his son Marcus Calloway to his right, and 2 men Diane didn't recognize who were introduced briefly as our finance guys. Nobody offered last names. Diane walked in, made eye contact with Preston Calloway, and extended her hand. He looked at it. He looked at her. His eyes moved to Kessler, then back to her, and then he said it, in the tone of a man who had never once in his life considered that a tone might be wrong. "I don't do introductions with vendors." The room went very still. David Kessler opened his mouth and closed it. Marcus Calloway, who was 31 and had the look of a man who had spent his whole life quietly apologizing for his father without ever actually saying anything, looked down at the table. The 2 finance guys lifted their laptops. Diane Okafor did not move. She stood with her hand still extended for 1 full second, 2 seconds, 3 long enough that it stopped being a gesture and became a statement. Then she lowered her hand. She set her briefcase on the table. She pulled out the chair across from Preston Calloway and sat down. She said nothing. Preston Calloway shifted in his seat. He was the kind of man who needed noise to feel comfortable, and the silence she was offering him was not comfortable at all. He said, "Kessler tells me you're looking at the Charlotte project." Diane looked at him. She said, "I was." That word, was. Past tense. Kessler heard it, Marcus heard it, the finance guys heard it, Preston Calloway heard it too. But he was the kind of man who heard what he expected to hear. And what he expected was that this was a negotiating posture, a way of establishing leverage, something he'd seen in conference rooms 1,000 times. He said, "Good. We can walk you through the projections," Diane said. "That won't be necessary." She stood up. She picked up her briefcase. She looked at David Kessler, who was looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between understanding and devastation. She said, "David, I'll be downstairs." She walked out of the room. She did not rush. She did not slam the door. She walked the way she had always walked, steadily, like the ground under her feet was reliable, because in her world it was. In the elevator, she looked at her own reflection in the brushed metal doors. She was 54 years old. She had been in this business for 30 years. She had sat across from men like Preston Calloway more times than she could count. And she knew, she'd always known, that there would always be more of them. But she had also learned something, over 30 years, that Preston Calloway was about to learn too. She didn't say it out loud in the elevator. She didn't need to. She just looked at her reflection and pressed L for lobby and let the elevator take her down. David Kessler came down 11 minutes later. He found her standing outside on the sidewalk, in the March cold, with her coat buttoned and her briefcase at her side, watching the traffic on Park Avenue. He said, "Diane." She said, "I know." He said he didn't know who you were. She said he didn't know who you were. She said, "He knew exactly who I was. He just didn't care." She turned to look at him. "That's different, David." Kessler had known Diane for 9 years. He had watched her walk away from bad deals before. He knew the difference between anger and decision, and what he was looking at right now was pure decision. He said, "The Charlotte project really is strong." She said, "Find me a different project." He said, "Okay." She flagged a cab. Before she got in, she said, "I want it in writing that I was never in that building. Not as a courtesy. I just don't want to be associated with what's coming." Kessler said, "What's coming?" Diane said. "Companies like his only work when people like me believe in them." She got in the cab. "I don't anymore." The cab took her back across town. She had a 1 p.m. call with a developer in Austin, a 3 p.m. with her own team, and a dinner that evening with a woman named Sandra Reeves, who ran a pension fund out of Philadelphia and had been looking for a co-investment partner for 2 years. She made a note in her phone to follow up with Sandra before dinner. She did not think about Preston Calloway for the rest of the day. This was not something she forced. It was something she had practiced. What happened next took a few months, which is how these things usually go. Preston Calloway's Charlotte project was a $280 million commercial development, a mixed-use block in the south side of Charlotte. Retail on the ground floor, 12 floors of office space above, 2 floors of residences at the top. It was a good project on paper. The land was already secured, the permits were moving. The anchor tenant, a regional bank called First Carolinas, had signed a letter of intent. But the capital stack had a hole in it. Calloway had his own equity, and he had a construction loan from a regional lender, but he needed a third piece, a private equity partner willing to come in for somewhere between $60 and $80 million. He had been shopping that piece for 8 months before David Kessler connected him to Okafor Capital. After Diane walked out, that piece stayed empty. Other investors looked. A group out of Boston did 3 weeks of due diligence and passed. A family office in Dallas asked for an extension on their review period, then passed. A fund based in Chicago got to the final stages and declined, citing concerns about the project's timeline. The timeline concerns were real. Preston Calloway ran his company the way he ran his conference rooms, with absolute confidence in his own judgment and very little patience for anyone who questioned it. His project manager, a man named Gene Whitfield, who had 40 years of experience in commercial construction, flagged the timeline as aggressive in a memo in April. Preston overruled him. Gene flagged it again in June. Preston told him to focus on his lane. In August, First Carolinas quietly withdrew its letter of intent. They had found another space. They didn't explain further, which they didn't have to. Without the anchor tenant, the residential floors lost their financing. Without the residential financing, the lender on the construction loan got nervous and triggered a covenant review. The covenant review found 2 violations. The lender put the loan on watch. By October, the Charlotte project was in serious trouble. Preston Calloway called David Kessler in October. This was a thing Kessler had not expected, but perhaps should have. Calloway said he was open to revisiting conversations with potential investors. Kessler said he would make some calls. He did not call Diane Okafor, because he already knew what she would say, and because he respected her enough not to waste her time. He called 2 other people. Neither of them was interested. The word was out. What happened inside the Calloway Infrastructure Board wasn't public, but some of it came out later through people who had been in the room. There were 6 board members. 3 of them had been expressing concerns about Preston's management style for 2 years, privately, in the way people express concerns when they're afraid of the man at the center of the table. After the Charlotte project collapsed, those concerns became less private. There was a meeting in November. Preston Calloway attended, expecting to discuss restructuring options. He left having been told that the board was commissioning an independent review of company management practices, which is the kind of sentence that sounds procedural but means something very specific. The review took 6 weeks. It found what 6-week reviews of companies like Calloway Infrastructure usually find: a pattern of decisions made by one person without adequate consultation, a culture that discouraged dissent, and a documented history of senior staff departures that the company had never examined too closely. Gene Whitfield, the project manager, gave a statement. So did 3 other people who had worked at Calloway Infrastructure and no longer did. In January, Preston Calloway stepped down as CEO. His son Marcus was named interim director while the board searched for permanent leadership. The official statement said Preston was transitioning to a senior advisory role, which is the kind of thing official statements say. He gave a brief interview to a trade publication 2 weeks later. He said there had been communication challenges on the Charlotte project. He said he was proud of what Calloway Infrastructure had built over 4 decades. He said he was looking forward to the next chapter. He did not mention the meeting in March. He did not mention the meeting in March. He did not mention the woman who had walked out. If he connected those 2 things, her leaving and everything that followed, he did not say so publicly. Maybe he didn't connect them at all. Some people don't. Diane Okafor did not know about most of this in real time. She found out about the Charlotte project collapse from a Wall Street Journal brief she read on a Thursday morning on her phone, while waiting for her coffee at the place on 47th Street she went to every morning. She read it once, set down her phone, picked up her coffee, and walked back to her office. She didn't talk about it. She had nothing to say about it that needed saying. That same month, Okafor Capital closed on a joint venture with Sandra Reeves's fund, a $110 million mixed-use development in Nashville, the largest deal Diane's firm had ever done. The groundbreaking was in April. It was a warm day, and Diane stood in a hard hat in a field in Tennessee with a shovel in her hand and thought about her mother leaving the house at 10 p.m. with tired feet, and her father wincing every time he stood up from a chair, and the 11-year-old girl who had decided she was going to make something out of this life. She thought about the conference room on Park Avenue, too. She thought about the second of silence after she lowered her hand. She thought about Preston Calloway's face when she said the word was. She held those things in her mind for a moment. The past and the present, the cost and the return. And then someone handed her a microphone and she said a few words about the project and thanked her team. And the moment passed. Some lessons don't need to be spoken out loud to land exactly where they're supposed to. If you've ever walked away from a room that didn't deserve you and built something better on the other side, you already know what Diane Okafor knew standing in that field in Tennessee. The shovel goes in the ground. The work begins. And the people who told you that you didn't belong, they're not invited to the groundbreaking. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you want to hear more, subscribe to Lineage Tales. We'll be right here.